Our speaker is Lawrence Cohen. Lawrence is a retired diplomat with the U.S. Department of State. During his foreign service career, he served in Mexico, Honduras, India, Hungary, Nigeria, Brazil, and Afghanistan. His Washington, D.C. assignments included stints in the Office of Environmental Policy, working on bilateral U.S.-Mexico and NAFTA issues, and as State Department desk officer to the Inter-American Development Bank. He's also served on short-term foreign service assignments in Iraqi Kurdistan region, very timely event, Tunis, and Kuwait. Mr. Cohen created the Foreign Service Institute's Afghanistan pre-deployment training program, facilitated Afghan training for USAID personnel, and developed diplomats training for the South Sudanese Foreign Ministry in Juba. He served as the retired vice president on the governing board of the American Foreign Service Association. I'm going to welcome Larry to the podium right now.
Can everybody hear me back there? Okay. Some of you may have been at the presentation that I did back in April at the restaurant, one of the morning sessions. I've tried to change this up a little bit, so we have some new material that isn't going to be totally repetitive, but you may find some of the slides to be very similar to what you saw before. To be honest, we set this topic months ago, and at the time, immigration seemed to be the most urgent foreign policy issue that we faced. But if we were to come up with a presentation today, it would be completely different. I'd love to talk about Kurdistan right now, or Ukraine. But I mean, the irony, of course, having Bayan Sami here last month, if you had actually scheduled her for October rather than for September, she probably would have canceled the event. But the topic today is going to be immigration and crisis or headache along the U.S.-Mexican border. We're going to start off with some terminology. This is basic terminology: citizenship, naturalization, visas. Everybody knows what a visa is, I hope. Refugees, asylum seekers. So we're going to go through all these topics. Anyone here who's a Native American?
Which version of Native?
Native American, like Iroquois, Cherokee, Mohawk. Okay. So, and is anybody here who is a naturalized U.S. citizen? Okay, a few. Great. The rest of you, I assume, are U.S. citizens as a result of your birth, correct? Okay. All of us are descendants of immigrants. Unless we have some Native Americans in the room that I don't know about, all of us are descendants of immigrants. The number one way to get U.S. citizenship is you were born here. So those of you who were not naturalized, you were born in the United States, correct? Or on U.S. territory. The second way that you could be a U.S. citizen is that your parent was a U.S. citizen. You may have been born abroad, but at least one of your parents was a U.S. citizen. You become a U.S. citizen, even though you were not born on U.S. soil. There's a law that was passed almost 2 decades ago concerning adoptions. So certain adopted children become U.S. citizens automatically upon adoption. Relatively few go through this process. And then the final category, and the one that we're going to focus on, naturalization. So if you're not born in the United States, those of you who were not born in the U.S., you achieved U.S. citizenship through naturalization, correct? We'll talk about that. And by the way, how many people got naturalized most recent year for which we have statistics? Over 700,000 people in 2017 were naturalized. So this is not a small number. You've also heard the term green card. We're going to talk about that as well. So naturalization is this process by which we confer citizenship. To become a citizen, you have to be, first, a legal permanent resident, or in the vernacular, a green card holder. You must have a certain period of residency in the United States, generally at a minimum of 5 years with a green card. Period of physical residence in the United States, at least half that time. Knowledge of U.S. history, good moral character, and favorable disposition towards the United States. This is what is required, the process by which naturalization takes place. Sounds pretty simple, but this could be a very, very tall bar for an immigrant. The green card. Is it everybody here heard of a green card? Okay. The green card is your proof of legal residency in the United States. So if you're a non-citizen, to be a legal permanent resident, you will be holding a green card. Your ID, basically showing that you are a legal permanent resident. It allows you to live and work in the United States.
Thank you.
The duration is for 10 years. So you can work on a green card, you can live in the United States as a permanent resident, and then renew the card after a 10-year period. You can live in the United States indefinitely, but you do have to renew your green card. Most green cards are issued to people through relationships, through family members. The way it works is that if you have a U.S. citizen spouse, or U.S. citizen's child, U.S. citizen parent, under certain age levels, etc., you can apply for IR status, immediate relative status, and apply for your green card. You get petitioned by your family member. You go for an interview for an immigrant visa, most likely at a U.S. consulate overseas. Could be done in the United States if it's a change of status, but most naturalizations occur from legal permanent residents who are related to U.S. citizens. There are other categories. Employment, for people who have extraordinary skills, extraordinary education, skills where there may be a shortage in the United States. Computer engineers, for example, there are certain categories for those kinds of people. You also have humanitarian categories, that is, people who have a legitimate fear of their home countries. They may be refugees, or they may become asylum seekers, and we'll speak about that in a moment. Victims of human trafficking, Violence Against Women Act. These also are certain categories by which people can get their green cards that are not necessarily family or are not relationships through family members. But the vast majority of people who get their legal permanent residence do it through family members. Non-immigrant visas. If you're a foreigner coming to the United States from most countries, you require a visa. We're very lucky as Americans because when we go abroad, many countries allow us to enter their territory without a visa in our passport. So anybody here who's been to Europe recently, you haven't needed a visa to go to the EU. If you've been to Ireland or England, you haven't needed a visa. Most people, however, from abroad do require visas to come to the United States. Those non-immigrant visas could be issued for a specific period of time, and they have a duration and specific purpose for which you are coming to the United States. You may be coming for tourism. You may be coming for business. Exchange students, ordinary trainees. Whatever purpose if you're coming to the United States for a short duration, you would be applying for a non-immigrant visa. It would be placed, if you are then approved by a consular officer, it would be placed in your passport. You would then come to the United States, and at the port of entry, you would show your visa to the immigration official at the port of entry, the passport control. That official then would let you in, or could turn you around, or could send you into secondary. But the visa is your license to apply for entry into the United States lawfully at a port of entry. That person who has that non-immigrant visa, if they are here legitimately, they came in legally, they have bona fide documentation, their passport is still valid, they have not violated the terms of their visa, they can change their status. Change of status means if you come over here as a tourist, you could change your status if you were accepted to school and become a student. You could change your status if you were to find it, if there were certain jobs that you might qualify under some of these other categories. That is change of status. You can only change your status from a non-immigrant visa status if all your documentation is valid, it's not expired, you have not committed any crimes on U.S. soil. This is kind of an important concept, because people coming to the United States, if they overstay their visa, if their visa is no longer valid, if their passport is expired, they cannot then change their status in this fashion. Immigrant visas. So there are two categories of visas. Visas for people who want to come to the United States for a short duration and have a home to which they intend to return. Those are non-immigrant visas. Immigrant visas are issued to those people who are coming to the United States with the intention of staying in the United States. Most immigrant visas, again, family reunification visas. Parent, spouse, child, again, under certain age limitations, etc. But that is where the vast majority of people who are coming as immigrants on visas come under family reunification. They will also be coming under, as I mentioned before, filling positions where there's a shortage of certain skills. Certain professionals with very advanced degrees. There's also a category, E5 category for investors. Investors, that an individual who will commit a minimum of $1 million and promises to employ a minimum of 10 people. They cannot be immediate family members. There's a special category for those people as well. By the way, very, very, very few visas are ever issued to unskilled labor. But there is a category. In the past, in the United States, we actually would issue visas to shepherds. There was apparently a shortage of shepherds in the United States, and there was a visa category for shepherds. But unless you are working in Mar-a-Lago, most likely you will not be able to get one of these visas. There is also the diversity visa lottery. Has anybody heard of the visa lottery? Okay. The visa lottery was set up at least 20 years ago to try to balance the imbalance among countries, that immigrants were coming from certain countries and kind of overwhelming the system. At the time, the idea was that you would issue a certain number of visas and it would be a lottery. People would put their applications in and you would pay a certain fee, and based on some computer algorithm, you would then, if you were one of the lucky people, your number might come up. The diversity diversity visa lottery would not apply to people from certain countries where we already receive a lot of immigrants: India, Philippines, Mexico, El Salvador, etc. No one country can have more than 7% of the lottery winners. And even though this administration has promised to end the lottery, it's still going on. So for the next lottery season, which by the way the deadline is coming up in a few days, the next lottery season is 55,000 visas. That sounds like a lot of visas, except for the fact that the last time around over 22 million people applied, which means your odds of winning are very low. But if you want to, try to, place your odds. I'm sure for many people in the world, it's worth trying to get become a lottery winner. Now, we hear the term illegal alien all the time. I think that personally, I think that's a pejorative, and I would prefer to use the term undocumented immigrant. There could be illegal entry, no doubt. A person can cross the border without showing any documents. That is illegal entry. But the person, him or herself, in my view, should be categorized as undocumented. They may have entered the United States without showing any paperwork, or they may be here with papers that expire. They may not have the right documentation that would allow them to stay. And oftentimes, certainly until recently, many of the people who would have qualified as, or would have been called undocumented immigrants, really were seasonal workers who came here to work in agriculture or maybe in construction, and then would return home oftentimes for Christmas. So the term undocumented immigrant applies really to anybody who has entered the United States without going through the border process without the correct documentation. There's a question that comes up quite a bit. Can a person who is here as an undocumented immigrant change their status and become a legal permanent resident and get their green card? Yes, it's possible, but it's extraordinarily challenging because they have to already qualify under immediate relative status, that is parent, child, or spouse that's already a U.S. citizen. In most cases, they won't be able to do this. They might have to return to their home country. There might be a period of time that they would have to wait before they could apply again. All sorts of rules and laws. The real answer here is, when in doubt, speak to a lawyer. Immigration law is extraordinarily complicated. And the Immigration and Naturalization Act is like 3 inches thick, and policies change all the time. You really need to have some legal guidance before you enter this whole process. But the real answer here is, in most cases, a person here who is undocumented will not be able to change status to become a legal permanent resident. Now, there is a category, you notice here, if qualified for asylum. We'll get into asylum in just a moment. A refugee. Is anybody here who had ever in their lives been a refugee? Okay, one hand back there. Where were you coming from? Yugoslavia, okay. Anyone else? A refugee is an individual that is seeking legal protection, fleeing from persecution, war, whatever. Refugees and asylum seekers, and there is a difference, have a well-founded fear based on these 5 items. Race, their race, based on their religion, based on their nationality, their political opinion, or their membership in a particular group. These 5 categories are embedded in international covenants, embedded in U.S. law. And so a refugee, who is fleeing based on these 5 areas it can be assigned refugee status. Also, there is temporary protective status, TPS, which is issued to people where they're coming from countries that have been found eligible for reasons that may not necessarily have to do with warfare, for example. TPS status was given to Haitians after the earthquake. TPS status was given to Hondurans a little over 20 years ago after Hurricane Mitch destroyed Honduras. So TPS status has a time limit. It can be renewed, but this is another protective status that people would be able to come in from eligible countries and stay here for a specific duration. The difference between a refugee and asylum seeker. Now, both refugees and asylum seekers are seeking asylum. A refugee, however, is seeking asylum from another country and is in that other country. For example, if you're a Syrian and you fled the violence in Syria and you're in a refugee camp in Lebanon or you're in a refugee camp in Jordan, you're most likely in a UNHCR, United Nations camp. You would apply for refugee status with the United Nations. They would interview you, they would do the background checks, go through the whole process of making sure that you are bona fide as a refugee. The process may take a few years. And then once they determine, they've accepted that you would be eligible for refugee status, they would essentially shop you around and seek countries that would offer you asylum. So a refugee is someone who receives permission before they come into the country and for asylum. An asylum seeker, again, may be fleeing by the same type of violence as a refugee, but they are already on U.S. soil when they make their application. Refugees in the past, anybody here remembering the Cold War? Many stories of refugees, of people who would run into the U.S. Embassy in Moscow or in other countries behind the Iron Curtain seeking asylum. They may have been fleeing the KGB or whatever, but because they reached a U.S. Embassy or consulate, that was considered, for purposes of asylum, considered U.S. territory. So that was the residual of the Cold War, is this idea of asylum seekers coming into embassies seeking asylum. But they can also come into the United States across the border. So they may come into the United States at a bridge, they may come across the river, but once they cross into the United States and reach U.S. territory, then they are by law allowed to seek asylum. I said seek asylum, not necessarily gain asylum. People who are seeking asylum in the United States can do it one of two ways. They can do it affirmatively, or they can do it defensively. Most of the people coming to the border now are trying to seek asylum affirmatively. That is, that they are coming to the United States and literally asking for asylum once they reach the United States. If they were doing it defensively, it would mean that they would be apprehended first. That is, maybe they were picked up by the Border Patrol first and arrested, then they sought asylum. The difference being that if you are seeking asylum affirmatively, the process is basically a more bureaucratic one where you get adjudicated by a refugee officer, by an agency of DHS. If you're seeking asylum defensively, that's when you must appear judicially in front of a judge, an immigration judge. So even though it may seem like we're splitting hairs here, whether you are an asylum seeker, offensive or defensive, affirmative or defensive, the difference is the entire process that follows. An affirmative asylum seeker may be in the United States for up to 1 year before they formally seek asylum. They're eligible up to 1 year, And in that time, they can go up to a law enforcement officer or an immigration official and say, I seek asylum. Problem is, bureaucratically, we have a huge backlog of people in the United States who are seeking asylum. One of the reasons is because our agencies are extraordinarily short-handed. And I brought my daughter here today. She's right here, Rebecca. Rebecca actually works for Citizenship and Immigration Services, so she knows a bit about this whole process and spends a lot of time working individually with cases. As I said, a defensive asylum seeker was already apprehended before they seek asylum. Once they are apprehended, if they seek asylum, it's a defense against immediate deportation, but they still have to go through the process in front of a judge. And again, when you hear stories from the border of family detention, most likely many of those detainees could be defensive, they could have been caught, but we also see many people detained who were affirmative asylum seekers, and in the past they probably would have been released on their own recognizance and given a date to appear before the appropriate official. But now they would be as well would be detained. A little bit about our policy. I would say that the basis of our policy today is the use of fear as a deterrent. Now, there's always been a sense, of anybody who's leaving their home country, who is fleeing violence, or anything in their home country, there must be a large element of fear in the process. Anybody leaving their home for any reason, I cannot imagine that this would be an easy act, easy decision to take. But we're using fear as a policy, as a deterrent to try to scare people from coming. One of the ways we do that is we criminalize the entry process in the United States. So again, by treating people more as criminals and then putting them in immediate detention, again, is a use of fear. Zero tolerance, especially towards migrants from Central America, which would not be applicable to migrants perhaps from other parts of the world. Mandatory separation and detention, which again, we've had family separation and detention in the past, but it was not used as an overwhelming policy tool the way it is now. It was done under different circumstances and I would argue a bit more humanely. Efforts to expedite expulsion, expedite removal. A stricter interpretation of credible fear. So when you apply for asylum under those categories that I described before, those 5 categories, the real issue is, do you have a credible fear in your home country? A more strict interpretation of that would mean that you're setting the bar higher for the applicant. Physical barriers, of course, and by the way, it's impossible to put a wall on 2,000 miles of the southern border, if anybody's ever been to Big Bend National Park or along the border. The imposition of third country asylum rules, which means that an applicant for asylum, say a person fleeing from violence in Honduras, would first have to seek asylum in Guatemala or Mexico before seeking asylum in the United States. Well, first of all, this may be a violation of U.S. law or U.S. covenants with other international covenants, but also think of the difficulty of applying for asylum in a country that you really are trying to flee. And finally, as I kind of hinted at the beginning, the use of more pejorative terminology towards migrants and immigrants, I think, is a way to kind of not only generate fear among the migrants themselves, but to generate fear among the United States population, among us. Question that comes up is family separation a human rights issue? There could be great debate about this, but what's interesting is that international covenants concerning this kind of treatment, the United States has signed treaties and covenants, UN conventions, regarding protecting the rights of the child and economic refugees, and yet we're one of the few, if only, countries never to have ratified some of these conventions. So you could make the case that our treatment of children does not violate our international obligations because the United States never ratified that particular convention. I think it's a very weak read, but it's certainly, in theory, we can argue, well, we don't have to follow this because we never ratified the convention. Now, remember, in the United States, it takes 2/3 of the Senate to ratify a treaty. So the barrier to ratification for any treaty is very, very high. We do respect, we would argue that, the United States would respect these rights, whether we're a member of that particular covenant or not. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees and the United Nations people who are involved in protecting the rights of children argue persuasively that separating children from their parents is never in the interest of the child. And it constitutes a civil rights or child rights violation. U.S. policy over the course of time, in some sense, there's been a lot of dynamism in U.S. policy in recent years, but in other sense, it's actually been pretty static over a long period of time. Going back to the Reagan years and Bush years, where there really was no strong interest in ratifying these international covenants, the Clinton and Obama administrations didn't believe that it was politically expedient to do so, that they might have great difficulty getting these covenants through the Senate. So over a long period of time, the United States has had an opportunity to place its stamp on these international conventions on human rights, but we've not done so. And again, it's a kind of a black eye on the United States to say that we might be the only country, or one of only a few countries, never to have ratified international covenants that would protect children. Finally, I just wanted to leave some food for thought, and I would prefer not to have to answer these questions because each one of them would take an hour. But the questions that come to my mind that we should think about when we regard U.S. policy: do the threats to seal the border actually drive asylum seekers? That is, if you fear that it's going to be more difficult to cross in the future, do you try to rush the border now? And I use the analogy, if you think mortgage rates are going up, you go to your bank now. So if people who are coming to the United States to either seek asylum or live in the United States, if they believe that it's going to get tougher, is that driving a surge? If the United States government holds assistance funds hostage, as for example, when the decision was taken not to release funding for Honduras, or we could say Ukraine, is that also a factor that by making circumstances worse in those countries, you're actually driving migration? These third country agreements that I spoke about before, okay, is that a form of coercion? I would say that we should consider, we may be violating our own laws by forcing people who are seeking asylum to force them back into the country from which they came. So it would be forcing somebody who reached U.S. soil in Laredo, Texas, and forcing them back into Mexico. Does that violate U.S. law? It certainly could possibly violate U.S. tradition. If you try to squeeze those people at the ports of entry, are you then encouraging them to go around and try to cross the river, for example? If you turn people back at Laredo and say, no, you have to wait in Mexico, are they then are they desperate enough then to cross without showing any documentation or not going through a port of entry? That's certainly would be very logical if you are desperate trying to get into the United States. Economic impacts. Is it in our economic interest to zero out immigration completely? Certainly we want immigration to be legal, and we want immigration to be processed in a very logical fashion, but by closing down immigration, are we hurting ourselves? Many of the jobs that immigrants do take are jobs that Americans probably are not looking to take. So we have to look at the economic impacts of driving down immigration numbers. And by the way, if we want to see how a country moves forward without any immigration or population growth, all we need to do is look at Japan. And finally, is this a moral issue? Are we as Americans following our moral traditions, responsibilities by having this type of policy, or are we kind of tripping over ourselves and kind of giving ourselves a black eye with regards to how we treat migrants? Again, if we're looking upon this as a kind of in a theological term, if we were saying, is this the Christian thing to do? Okay, that's to my mind is a very serious food for thought. So with that, I'm going to leave it open, and I'm very happy now to take those infamous cards that you've all created.
A whole bunch.
Sure.
Thank you very much. I'll shoot the question, and you got the answer.
Okay, if I can.
Well, no doubt about it. President Trump has recently, we believe, capped immigration at a relatively low level. Is that correct?
I think what you're referring to is refugees.
Okay.
Okay, so refugee numbers, I believe towards the end of the Obama administration, our refugee numbers were around 80,000. Rebecca, do you know? Okay. So I believe what that's referring to is refugee numbers. Yes, refugee numbers have been ratcheted down dramatically. I think in this year it was down to 10,000 or less, maybe 7,500, which, by the way, is extraordinarily low for refugees, given that we're talking about millions of people who have already obtained refugee status in camps. But I think the intention of the administration is to bring that already low number down to zero in the next fiscal year. I think that's what it's referring to.
Another question. What are the main reasons immigration services are understaffed?
You want to go there? I probably have to say two reasons. One is we underfunded as a country, as a government. It's grossly underfunded. And by the way, we don't train our people sufficiently to perform their jobs. So that's part of it. There's a tremendous shortage at the border with Mexico, judges and immigration officers. And I'd probably also say that, yeah, there has been periodic surges in recent years of immigrants. I think the number of people who are waiting is like 10 times the number of just a few years ago. So, yes, a huge backlog has been created primarily because of underfunding.
Thank you. From a Kutztown High School student, is there a major language barrier at the U.S.-Mexico border? And if so, how does that impact immigration?
There's no language barrier to speak Spanish. I don't think that's really the key question here. Language, I mean, first of all, most immigrants to the United States, if they themselves don't become, fluent English speakers, their children do. Obviously, Spanish is pretty much the second language in the United States. But every wave of immigration has had this issue of immigrants who come to the U.S. who have to learn English from scratch, including certainly my great-grandparents, and I'm sure all of your grandparents and great-grandparents. So I don't think the language barrier is really that relevant.
Okay. What must an asylum seeker produce to prove that they are threatened by violence? Does that gang violence cover one of the persecution categories?
Well, I believe from those categories it does not. Again, is it based on race, religion, nationality? Those five categories were pretty much created at the beginning of the Cold War. So if you looked at refugees through the lens of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, refugees were fleeing. Why would they have been fleeing after or during or after World War II? Probably because of those 5 reasons. And especially during the Cold War, the people who were fleeing communism. Again, that was seen, yes, as a legitimate refugee, whether they were fleeing Hungary in 1956 or fleeing Cuba, okay, that was easily would fall within these categories. The problem today is that most refugees today probably do not easily fall within those categories anymore. It's hard to say a person fleeing from gang violence and drug lords in their home province are fleeing because of those one of those 5 categories. And the United States does not recognize economic refugees or social refugees. We only really recognize the political side of refugee status. So the answer, in my view, would be no.
What is it costing us per person to house, feed, and care for the illegal immigrants? And what do you think of people who cross the border illegally and then sue the government for inadequate health care?
I think that comes under the category of urban legend. But the cost is legitimate.
Right.
The cost, because the United States government has privatized so much of its, services, and by privatizing prisons and detention camps, by putting the profit motive, who am I talking to? I mean, you have the Berks Detention Center here. By privatizing this process, the incentive is actually, first of all, to keep costs high, and second, to keep your population high, okay? So the incentive here is to put as many people as possible behind the wire and basically to charge Uncle Sam as much as you can. That I'm kind of sharing, this is more my opinion than based on any actual fact, but I certainly have seen the numbers of over $750 or so per detainee per night or something, and that's absolutely outrageous.
Does the U.S. have a guest worker program? Should we maybe have that guest worker program to the extent that we still do it, be a vehicle to a way to transition to?
We did have a guest worker program. In fact, during World War II, we had the Bracero program. So Mexicans would come into the United States under this program, and there was a labor shortage in the United States during the war. So this was a vital element in our economy for a number of years. I think it lasted into the 60s. We do not have a guest worker program. It certainly might be an issue for serious discussion. I cannot conceive of this Congress or the administration ever passing one. We do have, of course, a kind of guest worker program for high-tech workers, but no, for the kind of people who are coming here to pick lettuce or strawberries, no, we don't.
Here's asking you to forecast the future, maybe. The population of many countries are projected to decline sharply in the near future, largely due to declining birth rates. Several futurists predict that such countries may be willing to pay immigrants to come and stay in their country in the future. Comment?
Yes. I mentioned Japan. This is what we do not want to become. Japan has a replacement birth rate well under population growth. So their numbers are shrinking dramatically. I think if I remember, I think it's like 1.3 children per mother or per woman, which means you don't replace your population. Japan does not have legal immigration to speak of. They have very, very, very few people can immigrate into Japan. And so Japan is suffering now from depopulation, which maybe in a country like that is, for a short while, may not be bad, but it also means their population is aging dramatically. And who are going to be the workers in the future who will then provide for the elder people who are in the population. And if the trends were to continue in Japan, apparently they would reach zero population in about 60 or 70 years. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's the draconian trend. If you do not have population that is being augmented by immigrants, in the United States, most likely our population would decline and our economy would decline, but most seriously, we would age. And that aging population is something you can sustain for a little bit, but when you hit the Japan level, it's unsustainable, and that's what we would face.
Okay. Subject of sanctuary cities now. Is there a federal issue raised when local governments refuse to aid the federal government in detaining undocumented immigrants?
That's an issue I may want to avoid. But it clearly, you have federal law, you have state law, you have local ordinances, law enforcement. I will say this, by scaring my immigrants, undocumented immigrants, and forcing them underground by allowing law enforcement to enter into any area, by forcing them underground, you're creating more of a risk to the general population, because now you're creating a population of people who will be afraid to approach the police, or afraid to go to the hospital, or afraid to use services when necessary. It's the idea that if you prohibit undocumented immigrants, or from say a driver's license, I'll throw that out as an example, then you're basically going to have people driving without licenses. Is that what we are trying to encourage? So I think, I'm not going to get into the sanctuary city issue, but I certainly think that we do not, as a country, want to drive people deeper underground if we can help it.
Okay. Certain people say that the local police are more inclined to support that policy.
Yes.
And that it somehow makes their job easier. And that's why they're supportive of the federal policy.
Well, law enforcement at the local level rely on people at the local level. If you are an undocumented immigrant and you witnessed a crime, the police will want to be able to interview you as a witness, okay? But if you've been driven underground through fear of being raided by ICE or detained, then it makes life a lot more difficult perhaps for the local law enforcement. And that's where I see the challenge comes in, that you don't want to push people away from the local law enforcement. You want to have them at least have the confidence that if they were to go to the police or go to local authorities, go to local hospitals, that they wouldn't be handcuffed and taken away.
Okay. I have several more questions here from the audience. They're really good on immigration, but I don't want to miss this opportunity. We don't want to miss this opportunity to hear you comment on this question. How can Trump justify abandoning our Kurd allies?
I would love to, yeah.
It goes on, it gets better. What did Erdogan have to give up in order to facilitate Trump's agreement?
I wish I knew. I mean, what's happened this week with the Kurds, is frankly an abomination. I mean, no country, no group or country in the world today will ever trust the United States. We have completely lost our moral authority. And the American century, which started after World War II, is now officially over. Sad as that is, we do not have any special status in the world today as that shining city on a hill or a beacon of democracy or whatever you want to call it. We have now basically ripped that up. And so I think the answer that I would say here is he may not have had anything. Erdogan may have just sweet-talked him. But clearly it is a violation of our own humanity to leave the Kurds in this fashion. It really is.
While we're on that subject, we have in the audience. The Kurds are acting as prison guards for how many thousands of former ISIS fighters. What's the likelihood, in your opinion, that that they're going to remain in prison?
Well, that I don't know, but there's been a long history between the Kurds and the Turks. I'm not going to get into that. That, by the way, might be a great discussion point in the future. But the Turks have a huge minority of Kurds in Turkey. They, of course, under the Ottoman Empire, they had even more Kurds under their rule. They view the Kurds as a kind of a fifth column. If anybody here doesn't know what a fifth column is, I would suggest you Google that. They also have a problem in Turkey proper with the PKK, which is considered by the Turkish government a terrorist organization. The Kurds don't think so, but the leader of the PKK, Aslan, has been imprisoned in solitary confinement now, I think, for about 20 years. The Turks take this very seriously. They do not want to see a Kurdistan, any kind of Kurdistan on their border. This is an opportunity for them to eliminate one of their major threats. There's now no force in the area that could stop them from moving further in beyond Syria if they wanted to. If they wanted to move to Erbil or wherever. Turkey has the second largest military in NATO after us. So that's it. I mean, and also this was done clearly with the connivance of Vladimir Putin. So if you trust Vladimir Putin, then I have a bridge to sell you. So this is clearly, probably from a foreign policy point of view, is a disaster for us, but particularly for our allies, the Kurds.
Thank you very much. There are several more questions here on immigration, but I think we've run out of time, and this is a good note to on Kurdistan and the latest.
I'll be happy to hang around if you wish.
Good. Well, I invite people who have any questions that we haven't been able to get to please come up and ask Larry. He'll be happy to answer your questions. Thanks very much.